Don't you move! Hands on the wheel!
Officer, my hands are right here. I am permitted to transport those.
I don't care! Get out of the car right now! Get out! I will shoot you!
I am exiting slowly. I am a federal agent returning from qualification.
Yeah, sure you are! Get on the ground! Face down, now!
Deputy Gary Nelson, an officer with 3 years on the county sheriff's force and a documented history of pulling his service weapon on Black and Latino motorists, was patrolling County Road 114 when he pulled over a charcoal gray Toyota 4Runner for a muddy rear license plate. Despite the driver pulling over safely, turning off the engine, and keeping his hands clearly visible on the steering wheel, Nelson bypassed every standard procedure. When his flashlight beam caught 2 locked rifle cases on the back seat, Nelson didn't ask for a permit. He didn't ask a single investigative question. Instead, his inherent bias took over. He drew his 9mm pistol, pointed it directly at the driver's head through the glass, and made a racially coded threat that was caught on crystal clear audio. What Nelson didn't know was that the black man staring down the barrel of his shaking gun was off-duty FBI Special Agent Adrian Carter, a 10-year veteran of the Bureau's elite hostage rescue team. Nelson had no idea that his decision to let racial profiling dictate his tactics would not only cost him his badge, but would trigger a sweeping Department of Justice civil rights investigation into discriminatory policing, resulting in a multi-million-dollar federal lawsuit. Before we go further, what city are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And if you believe a citizen should be able to legally transport firearms without being profiled and threatened with death, like this video and subscribe. Adrian Carter was driving home in the late afternoon. He was 38 years old, athletic, and dressed in a faded gray hoodie and a baseball cap. To an objective observer, he was just a guy heading back from the shooting range. As a senior operator on the FBI's hostage rescue team, he had just finished a mandatory quarterly firearms qualification. His issued rifles were locked in soft cases. His tactical vest was in the back. Everything was legally secured. Deputy Gary Nelson sat in his cruiser a few miles down the road. Nelson was not just poorly trained, he was a walking liability. Over the past 2 years, 4 formal complaints had been filed against him. Every single one was filed by a Black or Latino man. Every single complaint alleged that Nelson had bypassed standard protocol, escalated immediately, and drawn his weapon without legal justification. His supervisors knew about the pattern. They filed the reports away, defending him as proactive rather than addressing the glaring racial disparity in his use of force. It was a massive institutional failure, a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. When Nelson saw Carter's muddy license plate, he flipped on his lights. Carter pulled onto the wide gravel shoulder, shifted into park, and locked his hands at the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel, exactly as he was trained to do. Nelson walked up to the driver's side window. He didn't introduce himself. He just shined his high-lumen tactical flashlight into the rear passenger window. The beam hit the tan rifle cases. To an objective officer, this is simply a moment to ask a procedural question. "Sir, do you have any weapons in the vehicle?" But Gary Nelson's brain didn't process the scene objectively. He didn't see a hunter, a sportsman, or a law-abiding citizen. He saw a black man in a hoodie with firearms, and his mind instantly equated that specific combination with an imminent, lethal criminal threat. If the driver had been white, the interaction likely would have consisted of a polite question about hunting season. Instead, Nelson's bias triggered an extreme, violent escalation. In a fraction of a second, Nelson dropped his flashlight. He ripped his service pistol from its holster, punched it out toward the driver's side window, and aimed directly at Carter's head. "Gun! Don't you move a muscle!" Nelson screamed, his voice cracking with aggressive panic. "I know exactly what your type is up to. Show me your hands or I'll blow your head off." I know exactly what your type is up to. Those 11 words, permanently recorded by the Axon body camera, stripped away any defense of officer safety. Inside the SUV, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Adrian Carter didn't panic. He didn't yell back to defend himself. His HRT training kicked in, not to fight, but to manage the terrified, heavily armed deputy standing outside his window. Carter froze entirely, employing extreme, calculated physical compliance. He just stared straight ahead, his face a mask of cold discipline. The contrast was staggering. The local deputy was shaking, screaming, and unraveling on the shoulder of the road, while the federal operator with a gun to his head remained completely silent, treating the cop like an active threat that needed to be surgically managed. "Officer," Carter finally said, his voice deep, slow, and completely devoid of fear. "My hands are on the wheel. I am an off-duty federal agent." But Nelson, blinded by his own profiling and adrenaline, refused to listen. "I don't care what you are," Deputy Gary Nelson screamed, the barrel of his 9mm pistol trembling just inches from the driver's side glass. "Open the door with your left hand. If that right hand moves off the wheel, I will put a bullet in you." Inside the SUV, Special Agent Adrian Carter processed the commands not as a citizen dealing with an erratic police officer, but as an HRT operator managing an unpredictable armed threat. Nelson's commands were panicked and contradictory, classic signs of an officer suffering from adrenaline overload and poor tactical training. Carter knew that any sudden movement, even a slow reach for his credentials, could trigger a negligent discharge from a deputy who had already decided the black man in the car was a lethal threat. Carter became entirely mechanical, employing extreme physical compliance. "I am releasing my left hand from the steering wheel," Carter stated, his voice clear but completely flat. "I am reaching for the door handle. My right hand is remaining on the wheel." "Do it, now!" Nelson barked. Carter popped the door open. The moment the latch clicked, Nelson lunged forward. He grabbed the fabric of Carter's hoodie, aggressively pulling the 200-pound operator out of the driver's seat and forcing him face down into the dirt and gravel of the highway shoulder. Carter did not brace himself or tense his muscles. He absorbed the impact and immediately placed his hands behind his back, surgically removing any physical excuse Nelson might use to justify further force. Nelson dropped his knee hard into the center of Carter's spine, jamming the muzzle of his pistol against the back of Carter's head while fumbling for his handcuffs. The metallic ratchets clicked loudly as Nelson secured the steel cuffs, tightening them until they bit into Carter's wrists. "I got you. You're done," Nelson breathed heavily as he holstered his weapon. Convinced his profiling had just been validated, he grabbed Carter by the collar, hauling him up to his knees and pressing him against the dusty quarter panel of the 4Runner. "I advised you that I was an off-duty federal agent," Carter said quietly, his face smeared with dust. "Yeah, right. Save it," Nelson scoffed, his confidence fully returning now that the subject was physically restrained. He began a heavy-handed pat-down search. "Let's see who you really are." Nelson reached into the back pocket of Carter's jeans and extracted a heavy black leather bifold wallet. He stepped back and flipped it open. The audio on the body-worn camera captures a sudden, profound silence. The yelling ceased. The heavy breathing stopped. Catching the late afternoon sun, deeply embedded in the custom leather cutout, was the solid gold shield of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Directly next to it was a Department of Justice identification card bearing the official seal, a photo of the man currently in handcuffs, and the title, Special Agent, Hostage Rescue Team. The footage captures a visible shift in the deputy's posture. Nelson hadn't just made a mistake on a routine traffic stop. He had drawn his service weapon on a compliant federal agent based on racial bias, placed him in handcuffs without cause, and his own body camera had just recorded every single second of it. Nelson lowered the wallet. His hands began to shake visibly in the camera's frame. I didn't know," Nelson stammered, his voice losing every trace of its previous command. "You had guns in the back. You didn't tell me." "I advised you of my status before exiting the vehicle," Carter interrupted, his tone completely cold. "Pick up your radio. Request your shift supervisor to this location immediately. I can take these off. Nelson reached forward quickly, desperate to remove the handcuffs and undo the mistake he had just made. Do not touch these restraints, Carter said, his voice freezing the deputy in place. You will leave them exactly as they are. Call your supervisor. Nelson stood motionless on the gravel. He looked at the FBI credentials in his hand, then at the handcuffed agent. Slowly, he reached up to his shoulder mic. The physical confrontation was over, but the fallout was just beginning. Deputy Gary Nelson's thumb trembled as he pressed the transmit button on his shoulder microphone. Dispatch, Unit 3 Bravo. Start a patrol supervisor to my location. 3 Bravo, copy. Unit 7 Samoa is en route, the dispatcher replied over the radio. For the next 9 minutes, the body-worn camera captures an agonizingly quiet standoff on the shoulder of County Road 114. Nelson paced back and forth, the FBI credentials still gripped tightly in his hand. He did not attempt to speak to the man in handcuffs again. Special Agent Adrian Carter remained leaning against his SUV, his hands secured behind his back. He did not complain about the tightness of the cuffs. He did not leverage his title to demand immediate release. By remaining completely silent and physically restrained, Carter was meticulously preserving the evidentiary integrity of an unlawful seizure. Every second that ticked by on Nelson's Axon camera was another second of liability for the department. At the 10-minute mark, a white Ford Explorer police interceptor pulled onto the gravel shoulder. Sergeant David Hayes stepped out. As a veteran shift supervisor, Hayes was trained to immediately assess the visual markers of a scene. He saw a civilian SUV, a black male secured in handcuffs, and his pale, visibly shaken deputy holding an open badge wallet. "What do we have, Nelson?" Hayes asked, keeping his voice level as he approached. Nelson swallowed hard, handing the leather wallet to his sergeant. "Ran a traffic stop for an obscured plate. I approached, shined my light in the back, and saw cased rifles and a tactical vest. I detained the driver. He's claiming federal status." Sergeant Hayes looked down at the gold shield and the DOJ identification card. He checked the holographic security overlays, a standard verification process. Finding them authentic, he looked at Carter, then turned his attention squarely back to his deputy. "Walk me through your reasonable suspicion to draw your weapon and apply restraints, Nelson," Hayes instructed. "What specific crime were you investigating?" This is the critical juncture of the encounter. A supervisor is required to verify the statutory justification for a subordinate's use of force. "He had rifles in the back," Nelson repeated, his voice defensive but weak. "I thought he was a threat. I didn't know who he was." Hayes stared at Nelson. In a state where the transport of secured firearms is entirely legal, the presence of cased rifles does not constitute a crime, nor does it justify a high-risk extraction at gunpoint. And Hayes, unlike Nelson, was acutely aware of the deputy's documented history of aggressively profiling black motorists. "Having rifles in a case is not a crime, Nelson," Hayes stated flatly, his tone reflecting the grim administrative reality of the situation. Without waiting for further explanation, Hayes walked directly over to Carter. "Agent Carter, I am Sergeant Hayes. I am removing these restraints right now," Hayes said, drawing his handcuff key. He quickly unlocked the ratchets, removed the steel cuffs, and stepped back to create a respectful distance. "Are you injured, sir?" Carter brought his arms forward, rolling his shoulders slowly to restore circulation. He turned to face the sergeant, maintaining the exact same cold, measured demeanor he had exhibited with a gun to his head. "I am not physically injured, Sergeant," Carter replied. "However, I am formally requesting that you document the condition and placement of the federal equipment in my vehicle. I am also advising you to immediately secure and preserve all body-worn camera footage from this encounter. My special agent in charge will be contacting your chief of police before the end of the hour." Carter wasn't asking for an apology. He was initiating a rigid procedural paper trail. He knew exactly what the body camera had recorded. the unprovoked escalation, the physical extraction, and the racially coded threat Nelson had shouted through the glass. Sergeant Hayes nodded slowly. As a supervisor, he fully comprehended the legal gravity of what had just occurred. "Understood, Agent Carter. I will lock the footage down as soon as I return to the precinct," Hayes said. He turned to his deputy, pointing toward the patrol cruisers. "Nelson, go sit in your vehicle. Do not mute your camera and do not make any phone calls." Once Carter's equipment was visually documented, he was cleared from the scene without a citation. He got back into his SUV and drove away. The physical encounter on the asphalt had ended. But for Deputy Gary Nelson and the entire county sheriff's department, the institutional nightmare had just begun. The flashing lights on County Road 114 were eventually turned off, and the physical scene was cleared. But the administrative machine that Special Agent Adrian Carter set into motion that afternoon was just powering up. When a local deputy unlawfully detains a citizen, the department might attempt to handle it quietly through internal discipline. When a deputy points a loaded firearm at the head of a compliant FBI hostage rescue team operator and bases that escalation on racial profiling, the incident transcends internal affairs. It becomes a federal matter. By 8 o'clock the following morning, the body-worn camera footage had been secured and reviewed by the Sheriff's Department command staff, the county's legal counsel, and the special agent in charge of the regional FBI field office. The review did not focus on Gary Nelson's subjective fear. It focused entirely on his objective actions and his recorded audio. The footage undeniably showed a traffic stop where the driver was entirely compliant. It showed a complete lack of investigative procedure, and most damningly, it captured the exact moment Nelson's racial bias overrode his training. "I know exactly what your type is up to." Those 11 words dismantled any potential defense the county's legal team could have mounted. Nelson could not claim he was acting in good faith based on the presence of firearms because the audio proved he was reacting to a discriminatory assumption about the man transporting them. Nelson was immediately stripped of his badge and placed on unpaid administrative leave. But the FBI was not satisfied with the suspension of a single deputy. The incident had exposed a rot much deeper than one man's panic. Agent Carter, represented by a private civil rights attorney and supported by the weight of the federal government, filed a $1.5 million federal civil rights lawsuit against Gary Nelson, Sergeant David Hayes, and the county. The lawsuit alleged severe violations of the 4th and 14th Amendments, specifically targeting unlawful seizure, excessive force, and racially discriminatory policing. Faced with an unwinnable court battle and a pristine piece of video evidence, the county settled the lawsuit within 6 months. However, the financial payout was only a fraction of the fallout. The blatant nature of the profiling caught on tape caught the attention of the United States Department of Justice. The DOJ's Civil Rights Division opened a formal pattern or practice investigation into the entire Sheriff's Department. Federal investigators subpoenaed Nelson's personnel file and discovered the 4 previous complaints from Black and Latino motorists. The exact complaints that Nelson's supervisors had dismissed as proactive policing. The DOJ audit concluded that the department possessed a systemic, tolerated culture of racial bias and unconstitutional use of force. The supervisors who had ignored the early warning signs in Nelson's file were forced into early retirement or demoted. To satisfy the federal mandate and avoid a total DOJ takeover, the county was forced to sign a consent decree, initiating a sweeping, statewide overhaul of its policing policies. The department was required to establish an independent civilian oversight board. They implemented strict new guidelines dictating that the mere presence of a legally transported firearm could no longer be used as the sole justification for drawing a service weapon or initiating a high-risk extraction. Furthermore, mandatory quarterly audits of body-worn camera footage were instituted specifically to identify and eliminate racial disparities in traffic stops before they could escalate into violence. As for Gary Nelson, his career ended exactly where it began, on the shoulder of County Road 114. He was officially terminated 3 weeks after the incident. Because his firing was tied to sustained civil rights violations, his peace officer standards and training, certification, was permanently revoked by the state board. At 28 years old, he was legally barred from ever holding police powers again. The footage of Adrian Carter's extreme compliance is now standard viewing in police academies and federal training centers. It serves as a cold, undeniable case study of what happens when institutional bias is allowed to masquerade as proactive patrol. Officer safety is a foundational necessity in law enforcement, but it is not a blank check for racial profiling. Fear is not a substitute for probable cause, and a badge does not grant anyone the authority to bypass the United States Constitution. When officers are allowed to systematically target citizens based on their own prejudices, the legal framework governing the street collapses. In this case, it took an elite federal operator looking down the barrel of a gun to finally force the system to correct itself. 8 months after the flashing lights faded on County Road 114, Gary Nelson walked into a windowless conference room in a downtown federal building. He was no longer wearing a sheriff's uniform or a duty belt. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit. He was no longer Deputy Nelson. He was simply the defendant in a $1.5 million federal civil rights lawsuit. Sitting directly across from him on the other side of the polished mahogany table was Special Agent Adrian Carter. Carter wore a tailored dark navy suit. His posture was identical to the day on the highway, perfectly still, intensely calm, and completely unreadable. He did not speak. He didn't have to. The plaintiff's civil rights attorney was about to do the talking for him. In cases involving police misconduct, the civil deposition is where the shield of officer safety is systematically dismantled. There are no sirens, no adrenaline, and no suspect to control. There is only the video evidence and the cold reality of the law. The attorney set a laptop on the table and pressed play. The Axon body camera footage filled the room. The audio of Nelson screaming, drawing his weapon, and dragging Carter into the dirt played at full volume. Nelson stared at the table, refusing to look at the screen. The attorney paused the video precisely at the 41-second mark. "I know exactly what your type is up to. Mr. Nelson," the attorney began, his voice devoid of any warmth. "You are under oath. Please explain to the room. When you pointed your loaded service weapon at the head of a compliant federal agent, what exactly did you mean by his type?" Nelson shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. His defense attorney had prepped him for this exact question, instructing him to lean heavily on the presence of the firearms. I meant tactical guys," Nelson stammered, his voice lacking any of the aggressive command it had on the highway. "People transporting weapons. In my experience, it's a high-risk indicator." The civil rights attorney didn't blink. He reached into a thick manila folder and pulled out a stack of internal affairs reports obtained during the DOJ discovery phase. "Let the record reflect that we are introducing Exhibit C, Mr. Nelson's use of force logs for the duration of his employment with the county," the attorney stated formally. He slid the papers across the table. "Mr. Nelson, according to your own department's data, you unholstered your service weapon during routine traffic stops 14 times in the past 36 months. Do you know what all 14 of those stops had in common?" Nelson swallowed hard. "I was prioritizing my safety. 100% of the motorists you drew your weapon on were Black or Latino men," the attorney corrected, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "Not a single white motorist. In a county where over 60% of the registered vehicle owners are white, and a significant portion of them are registered hunters who transport firearms legally. So, I will ask you again, Mr. Nelson, under oath. When you saw my client, did you draw your weapon because you saw a rifle? Or did you draw your weapon because you saw a black man? Checkmate. Nelson looked at his own lawyer, but there was nothing to be done. You cannot object to documented statistics. The deposition didn't just expose a tactical error, it legally proved a discriminatory pattern. Within 48 hours of that deposition, the county's insurance providers forced the department to settle the lawsuit for the full $1.5 million, knowing that taking Nelson in front of a federal jury would likely cost them triple that amount. Today, Gary Nelson works in warehouse logistics, stocking shelves for hourly wages. Every job application he submits requires him to explain why he lost his peace officer certification. He is a permanent liability. Adrian Carter remains a senior operator with the FBI's hostage rescue team. He continues to train local law enforcement agencies on high-risk de-escalation, using his own body camera footage as the ultimate instructional tool. The lesson of County Road 114 is permanent and undeniable. You cannot let implicit bias dictate your tactics. A badge is a public trust, governed strictly by the Constitution. The moment an officer substitutes racial profiling for probable cause, they aren't just violating a citizen's rights, they are destroying their own life. If you made it to the end of this breakdown, hit that subscribe button. Accountability isn't anti-police, it's pro-Constitution. Let us know in the comments which part of the deposition you think destroyed Nelson's defense the fastest, and we'll see you in the next review.